Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another Sunday School Teacher Workshop. Bit of a different venue. I'm trying to finally live up to what I have said in the past about what will happen on weeks I'm out. And so I have been unsuccessful in the past at arranging time to actually record while at home, but this is going to take the place of that. So when you're watching this, probably not too much of a change from what you see at church, although you have a much bigger screen to look at now with more capability, I suppose, of appreciating the slide, which is usually more difficult when we're together in church. Okay, enough of gilding the lily on that. So this week, as we round out our last unit within the last or the end of our first quarter together, we're deviating away from the book of Genesis, you can see on the screen here, and we're looking at the book of Job. So clearly, you don't need me to tell you if you've been studying and looking at this for a little while in advance, what route to take if you want to go in that direction or whatever direction. And of course, the text of Job 2 is worthy of consideration. But when it comes to looking at the book of Job and just taking 1 week to do it, I imagine many of us are probably already thinking with the view in mind of, my goodness, there's so much here to talk about. Do I talk only about what we read in the text, or do I try to help my students better understand the reason for the events of this book, why this book even exists in the canon? And if we're not careful, of course, there's a possibility we can wind up biting off more than we can chew. So naturally, trying to keep things a little bit more simple rather than complex is probably a better way to go. But as I say that and scroll to this slide here, I realize that I might be complicating things a little bit more um, than I intend to do with respect to this lesson. But I just want to give you a few tidbits of information here that might be helpful with respect to understanding where we could go with this book and why it's important to, and how it connects to the things that we've talked about. If anything, I would say perhaps a better use of our time with this would be connecting it to what we've been talking about in the previous 12 weeks in the book of Genesis. So, and I think that's definitely what the Gospel Project writers are attempting to try to do with whatever information they include in the leader guide and the commentary book and various other things. So whatever viewpoints they're drawing on, plus perhaps a few things here that you listen to, might be helpful with respect to gathering your thoughts on being able to teach this lesson. So I've repackaged the title here to Job, a tale of a priest who is purified through fire and sword. So start to finish, what I hope to be able to accomplish here in this 30-minute segment is to try to help open your mind up to what's in the opening chapter of the book of Job. And of course, what we're going to include here with the second chapter, briefly describe what goes on over the course of this book to lead us to the end point where in the last four chapters, God is addressing Job. And with that, Job's final remarks and how that leads to the conclusion of the whole story. And somehow try to connect that back to the events of what we've read in from the beginning of all things up through the life now of Joseph. So up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen with that first orange block, notice what is pointed out about Job in the opening chapter of the book. So I'll just read that to you quickly. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God, turned away from evil. Okay, so with that in mind, what we have here is an understanding to this first blue block. There was a man named Job, and he is of complete integrity, right? This word in Hebrew, tam, means blameless. Now follow with me through this first purple block. This is also said of all three of these men, Noah, Abraham, and Jacob, that Noah was a righteous man. Again, the word here is tamim, and it's a pluralistic form of it. But the idea, of course, is to convey that Noah was indeed righteous. Righteous does not mean perfect. The same is clearly not said of either Abraham or Jacob, and both of their stories bear that out in complete detail. And the same obviously is going to be said of Job, though his friends try repetitively to pin him down with some sort of fault that must have occurred in order for God to have just right to be able to judge Job as he has and bring these calamities upon him. Yet no one can really make anything stick. But by the end of the book, Job has made his own confession unto God and made it abundantly clear he knows he is not perfect. So we go to the story of Abraham, and while it's not exactly said of Abraham, perhaps in the same way it is of Noah, yet God appears to Abraham in Genesis 17 using the same word here, telling him to live or walk in his presence and be blameless, not giving him a command of something that was impossible, again, because blamelessness is not sinlessness. Blamelessness, perhaps, is better understood start to finish throughout Scripture as living rightly with both God and man. And as far as any human can point out, then that person is not in any way, shape, or form in violation of the law. So, granted, this takes on a bit more of a broader concept once the law is actually in place. It's not really easy to say how a person like Noah or Abraham, prior to the giving of the law, would have lived blameless outside of just what was expected of them and not doing anything that anyone could again point out and say was overtly wrong. And I think the definitions that Job's friends give probably would capture very well someone who would not be considered blameless, someone who takes advantage of widows or orphans, someone who is guilty of lustful thoughts and various other things. And so they're not wrong altogether in the things that they are assessing would be reasons for God passing judgment on a man. They're just wrong in asserting that Job must be responsible or guilty of these things, hence the reasons why God has punished him as he has. We go to Jacob. Jacob was a quiet man, but this is an interpretive choice by using the word quiet here rather than choosing to use the word blameless in Genesis 25, because the Hebrew word is indeed tam. Now, granted, Hebrew words can be used synonymously with other words, but nonetheless, an interpretive choice has to be made by the translation committee moving from Hebrew into English. So the reason why this is important, though, is because this word becomes far more significant and is repeated far more often in Levitical texts. Now, when I say Levitical texts, I'm not isolating it only to the book of Leviticus. Clearly, my example on the screen here doesn't even come from that. But as this word is mentioned first in Exodus, it's expounded upon much further as goes its use in the book of Leviticus. So this is applied to sacrificial animals, because here in Exodus chapter 12, with the first sacrifice that's made in that book by the people of Israel corporately, is with the Passover sacrifice. Moses' instructions to them, they were to choose an unblemished animal. Again, the Hebrew word is tamim. So to sum up real quickly, what we have here is a description by the author of the book of Job of the man, and it is stated that he is a man of complete integrity or uprightness or blameless, even. The word, as it's used in an application to other human beings, can even be translated as righteous or quiet, but the idea is that these people are complete in their sense of living uprightly with God and man. Again, I know it's a bit difficult to understand, but it does not convey the idea of sinlessness. It clearly can't, and not be in keeping with the rest of what Scripture teaches. When we read a passage like what is in Romans chapter 3 or 6, that all are guilty of committing sin, all have fallen short of the glory of God, right? But this word is also used in a different context, say in Exodus or Leviticus, and it is described to or used to describe a sacrificial animal that's about to be made use of in that particular liturgical context, and that as far as the eye can see, it seems to be spotless. Clearly, a full exam cannot be made, as goes doing an exam or an assessment using a machine like an MRI or whatever, to be able to see all the internal organs of the animal to know whether or not an organ has cancer or whatever the case might be, but it's not relevant because as far as the eye can tell, the animal appears to be blameless. And as far as the eye can tell of another person, as far as human characters are concerned, they appear to be blameless. So this connects us here to the idea in the outset that Job is first a priest, but as we develop this thought, that he is also something of a sacrifice himself over the course of the book, which starts to create all kinds of interesting connotations. Many of those we can't chase down in the time we have together, but I hope to explore a little bit of that with you. Back to the left side of the screen in this next blue block, Job is postured as a priest representing his family and friends before Yahweh, offering sacrifices, right? I mean, in a few short verses after the opening verse of the first chapter, we see that Job has several children. They're all adults. by the time this story takes place. And they're known to often go and host one another at each other's houses and throw parties. And Job is a little concerned that maybe when his children have drank a bit too much in their inebriated state, may have said something that is perhaps a curse toward God rather than blessing. And so Job is still interceding for the sake of his family by offering sacrifices before Yahweh to try to cover for or maybe atone for their sins. So, with that in mind, obviously he is exercising a priestly function for his family. Now, back to the middle of the screen, Job is himself going to be seen as an acceptable sacrifice before Yahweh. Remember when we use this term in not just Exodus, but Leviticus, the word unblemished here, tamim, is to be seen as acceptable. That's the connection I'm making, that Job is acceptable as a sacrifice before Yahweh. He, along with his family, are considered together as one block of people who before Yahweh are acceptable. I would be careful in trying to move the term of right or righteous or blameless from Job to his family, because nothing like of the sort is said with respect to his family when we read the context. But the work or action of Job is credited to his family. And we see that maybe not so much from the context itself here, but we understand this as far as a whole Bible theme from other passages of scripture that teach us the idea that a believer creates a sanctification over their family by virtue of the fact that they are a disciple of Christ and the family is set apart as holy before the Lord. That does not mean that the salvation of that believer who's a disciple of Jesus passes on or is shared in connection with unbelieving family members that occupy the same physical household as they do, or that exist in either marital or parent-child relationships with them. Far from it. But there is something special there with respect to the idea of how God accords the family like that. Anyway, to not go down that rabbit trail any further than that, the point I want to simply make, though, is that, again, Job is serving as priest, but is being seen or propped up here as an acceptable sacrifice himself, which throws us now into the crucible of what's about to happen over the course of this book, because before we even get to the end of the first chapter, calamity has already fallen on Job, right? So Job is essentially offered up as a sacrifice in both chapters 1 and 2 through the loss of his possessions and family, along with enduring accusations by his friends. Job is seen as more or less being the faultless one who is being placed on the altar. And by virtue of that, his friends and future family members and current family members are all finding access unto Yahweh. That's what we see by the end of the book. Walk with me through the next purple block. The fire and loss, along with persecution, made him presentable in the presence of Yahweh. So let's pause for a second and explain this. So anytime an offering is made, whether portions of that offering might be shared with other people, such as with a priest or maybe other family members, or even if it's a burnt offering and nothing is going to be shared, but everything placed on the altar itself is going to be completely consumed in the flames. The idea is that in the process of offering, the offerer is transcending through the offering of the smoke as the animal and its carcass is combusted down. And through the rising of that smoke, the offerer is going up into the very throne presence of Yahweh's temple that exists above the firmament, above the waters that are above. Again, this is a whole Bible concept, but if you've hung with me long enough, you've understood, as I've taught this before, this is the idea behind the burnt offering. That's the reason perhaps why the very first chapter of Leviticus outlining the first of the offerings is the burnt offering. The Hebrew word olah, which is translated burnt for us in English, means ascension. It's an ascension offering, right? And the idea, because it's completely consumed, then the offerer is holy, W-H-O-L-Y, transcending up into Yahweh by virtue of them sharing their essence with the animal, hence the reason they laid their hand on the head of the animal, and then so that the animal takes the brunt of the offering itself, or I should say the process of being sacrificed and then burnt up, so that the human offerer can live through that and continue to be a earthen vessel, if you will, of Yahweh's blessing and sanctification and so forth. That the animal is, of course, being offered up in the place of the person who's offering it in its stead, right? So by the time we get to the end of the book, notice what is said in Job 42. My servant Job will pray for you. This comes on the heels of God's command to Job's three friends. He's not satisfied at all with the words they said. He deems what they said about him and even some of the estimations they made about Yahweh himself as to be wrong. But he does not want them to make any form of penance. He wants them instead to go to Job, and Job will offer sacrifice. Job will pray for them, and God says that he will surely accept Job's prayer. So with that, that doubles back on the notion that Job, again, is functioning in a priestly capacity because he's interceding on the part of his three friends between them and Yahweh, as a priest is designed to represent creation before Yahweh and Yahweh before creation. And of course, he is going through these cultic practices of sacrificing an animal, manipulating blood, and doing all of that for the sake of whatever intended purpose. But again, to the point of Job being sacrificed, Job goes through all of this so that not only Job, but even Job's friends and all those others who will read of Job's story and come to understand what was going on here, that Job was offered going through the crucible of all the pain that he endured for the sake of not atoning for anyone's sins himself, but all for the sake of representing God before others so that they may know and understand God better. Now, this is part of that series of connections that I think is worth exploring, though there are many more beyond this. But I think if you've walked with me so far, maybe you've picked up on one or two points that perhaps are starting to trend toward direct connections to Jesus, such that the Bible arc that Jesus is coming at the end of with respect to all of these other characters who in some way have shared a portion of his essence. What I mean by that is everything that Jesus is the complete picture of many of these other Bible characters that we've already seen, an Adam, Noah, an Abraham, a Jacob, and now even Job, and many others what we will be introduced to as we go through stories yet to be studied out here, is to see they share some measure of who Jesus is going to be. They are giving us a prototypical prefiguring or foreshadowing of what we can expect with Jesus. And Jesus wraps it all together and creates the full total package of what we would expect with God's chosen servant, Messianic king, all the other descriptive titles that we could give. And one of those includes being the one who comes representing God in this priestly form. And of course, he makes statements directly in the Gospel of John. No one knows God except for the one whom he has sent. No one has seen God except for the one who has descended from above. He says to Nicodemus, if we tell you of earthly things and yet you don't believe, how can you believe when we speak to you of heavenly things? He's the only one who has come from heaven and knows firsthand, right? But because he is representing God, that's a priestly function. In some ways, it's a prophetic function as well. But Jesus is going to offer up himself in the crucible of his own passion, right? When he is consumed altogether by virtue of his crucifixion, and then, of course, delivered on the other side by means of his resurrection to continue to represent us before God. So back to the left side of the screen in the next orange block. I think it's important for us to appreciate the apocalyptic nature of the book of Job. Now, I know our brains seem to be somewhat hardwired now in our day and time to think of the word apocalypse as being world ending kind of stuff. And certainly there are calamities that befall Job that in a microcosmic kind of way, because it only happens to Job and his family, are almost apocalyptic if we're going to use that definition. But that's not the definition I'm trending toward, because that's not a biblical definition of apocalypse. Apocalypse in its basic sense means unveiling, the unveiling of God, the pulling back of the veil so that we can see what's going on the other side, as goes God's space, because God's space and man's space are firmly intertwined. They have been from the beginning of the story at that nexus point in the Garden of Eden, right? Now, there's been some measure of demarcating that space a little bit more firmly because of man's sin, and there's a need to separate that space more because God is holy and man no longer is. But these spaces are still firmly intertwined, such that God's prophets have the ability to peer beyond into God's own covenant, or I should say, I'm sorry, divine counsel, to listen to and hear and see the things that are going on that God is planning and hear the truth that God wants shared with his people. So in the book of Job, in the beginning chapter, we see the unveiling here of God's glory. We are transported right into God's throne room as all the sons of God and Satan are coming in before him. And as they are talking to God, God is asking Satan questions directly, and Satan is unveiling his own plans as to what he's been doing. And then there's this conversation with respect to what God has seen of Job and what God is about to do to Job, of course, enlisting Satan as part of that. So in the opening, the divine council assembles in secret, but by the end of the book, Job is now standing before Yahweh, granted in some sort of veiled form. It's a whirlwind, like God has veiled his presence in the past and not totally unveiled his glory. As he says to Moses, he cannot do that, and yet the human subject live. But while God is veiling his presence, he nonetheless speaks directly to Job. So with that, it's something of an apocalypse. So in the beginning of the book, we have one day the sons of God standing before the Lord, and by the end of the book, the Lord answering Job from the whirlwind. Now go to this next purple block with me. Job desires to see Yahweh and to plead his case, and when he gets to, he learns of his vast ignorance. So he says this in the closing chapter of the book at the beginning: surely I spoke about things I do not understand. So that is part of this whole arc. If you're a little confused, let me try to straighten this out for you. So at the beginning of the book, we're postulating that Job is seen as a priest. He's exercising priestly duties on the part of himself and his family, as if he were Aaron on the Day of Atonement, and he is offering up a sin offering or an offering of purification for the sake of cleansing the sacred space that he, as Aaron, the high priest, gets to go into and minister unto the Lord, but on behalf of the nation of Israel, representing the nation of Israel before Yahweh. Job is doing that not in some little sacred shrine that we have any record of, but he's doing this on the part of his family and trying to keep his family cleansed and acceptable before Yahweh. By the end of the book, Job is going to be doing the same thing. Though his children are dead, he's going to be doing this on the part of his own friends. And then after God restores him, he's going to have children in the future. And no doubt we can presume that Job continues to do this very thing for those future children who are going to be born. It's important for us to appreciate what the office and function of a priest is, because as it's outlined for us in Genesis 2, remember we went all the way back there at our first lesson to discuss the idea of both kingship and a little bit more directly the idea of priesthood, because that continued to be repeated more often in the stories that followed it than the idea of kingship. And so this connects back to that as mission one, filling the world with God, the glory of God. As the water fills the sea, so the knowledge of the Lord will fill the land, right? So that God's name will be made great among the nations everywhere, from the rising of the sun to its setting. Incense and offering will be made unto his name. So the idea there is that Job's story is not dissimilar from that. Job, to his own family and friends, so we've got a rather wide swath here. Um, we know these friends are distant travelers, so from the lands they come from, they would be able to carry this truth back with them. Who knows? Many others from those areas may know of Job as well, or know Job personally, and so who knows how the story would have impacted them. But the idea is that Job is taking on the priestly responsibility of representing Yahweh before creation. In this case, these particular image bearers. Job is offered up as something of a sacrifice as he goes through the awful sting of every bit of loss he has to endure and the humiliation that's offered up by his own friends. But the process through it all is to reveal secret knowledge about Yahweh that Job didn't understand, nor that his three friends understand, but now they have a more perfected understanding of who Yahweh is. Now, as to the reason why Job had to endure these things in order to understand, anyone's guess perhaps can be as good as the next, but clearly this seems to be something of a biblical pattern, one that Jesus himself will repeat, one that all the prophets seemingly have repeated: to suffer and have to endure usually the stubbornness and stiff-necked nature of God's own covenant people, the lambasting they're often offering toward God's prophet, their lack of desire to want to be humble and obedient in heart and submit themselves into the teaching, the lonely nature of the road that has to be walked by that person. And you can imagine Job sitting there, covered head to toe, bulls and sores, with sackcloth and ashes, clothing his skin, and in now his shaven head, expressing the lament and woe that he has. And no one else amongst any of the other characters can even remotely appreciate or empathize with Job, as they themselves have not experienced such. And so, all of that to say, the suffering on the part of God's chosen servants often reveals parts of Yahweh's character to others. And that too is part of a priestly duty or construct. So, by the end of it all, we get down here to this orange block that Job is like an Adam who serves as a priest and learns wisdom only by walking with Yahweh. Because he says this in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 42. My eyes have seen you. I reject my words and am sorry for them. So clearly, he's learned more than he could ever thought he would learn by hearing what Yahweh had to say of himself and all the questions and all the statements that Yahweh asked and put forth to Job, such that Job now can better inform, better teach other people about the Yahweh that he serves. So I hope that's been helpful. I know it's an interesting way of looking at the book of Job. And of course, our brief time together is nowhere near enough to be able to cover it all, but I hope that that's been informational for you in such a way that you can glean a few things from this. And then with that, hopefully it's helped in some way. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and end our time together. Thank you so much for listening.